Speaker.
I call David Clendon. 5 minutes.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to take that short call to reaffirm the Green Party's opposition to this anti-dumping countervailing duties amendment bill, as has been flagged earlier by my colleague Mojo Mathers. So this, as we've heard, dumping is a practice whereby a quantity of goods, products, be they primary produce or manufactured good, whatever it might be, gets dumped into a country from some other place, usually below the cost of sale in the country of origin. I guess our fundamental objection to this legislation is that it further weakens the protection for New Zealand producers, for New Zealand manufacturers, for the people who actually produce things and make things and employ New Zealanders here in New Zealand. I think those protections are already weak. We know that we are one of the least subsidised countries in the world, particularly in areas like primary production, and that in a sense is something to be proud of. Certainly I was pleased to be at the Balance Environmental Farming Awards last week, the national finals after a series of regional finals. And there's some pride within our primary production sector in the fact that they are not subsidised to any significant extent, and yet they manage to compete very well against producers who are. So our belief is that this introduction of a new consumer interest criteria would simply lead to a reduction in the protection afforded to our already quite exposed producers. And that's okay. We don't, New Zealand producers, manufacturers expect to compete, but the Greens have long argued that fair trade is different from free trade. Free trade is basically open slather. It's a race to the bottom about price compared with value. We think that fair trade actually is a much broader and a more structured position to take. And I think that this legislation would take us away from that notion of protection of our producers and our manufacturers who can compete, but they must be in a position where they compete fairly on something like an even footing. Dumping obviously counts very much against that. So the essential debate is whether do we protect local industry and jobs, or do we allow allegedly greater consumer choice, increase competition and provide cheaper goods. All of those latter three might on the face of it appear okay, but it's about short-term or long-term thinking. Yes, if we allow some country to dump a quantity of goods here, whatever that might be, then yes, in the short term, it means a consumer buys a product at a lower price than they would otherwise. But what about the supply chain locally? What if some primary produce is dumped in New Zealand, which effectively means arguably that 1 year's harvest from our local providers suddenly doesn't have a market, or at least a market at a price that assures even a reasonable return, a recovery of cost to the producer. That could be sufficient to send producers out of business. We know that primary production is it's not a place for the faint-hearted. A bad season due to weather or whatever, then suddenly dumping of goods on our market here could be enough to undermine the integrity, the investment, the employment opportunities of a given production, of a given supply chain. Similarly, the notion of competition. New Zealand companies and primary producers can and do compete, but it's important that they be able to compete fairly. How can New Zealand producers compete on price when they are obliged to meet the cost of the regulation that we in Parliament impose on them? Minimum wage requirements, health and safety requirements, environmental waste management laws, these sorts of things. These all impose costs on producers and manufacturers, and that's as it should be. How and why ought our manufacturers, our producers, be obliged to compete with producers who are not constrained by labour laws, by health and safety, or by appropriate environmental regulation? We see the weakening of the protection of our local producers and manufacturers would emerge almost inevitably from this bill, because it's a reflection of short-term thinking. It's about grab a cheap price now rather than think about the long-term consequence. It's about a cheap price rather than addressing issues of value. We will continue to oppose this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable David Cunliffe.